Okay, so imagine a political system that's built for, like, stability, right? And then suddenly it's just thrown into total chaos. That's kind of what we just saw happen in France.
Yeah, for the first time in like over 60 years, their government just fell apart because of a no confidence vote.
I mean, that's huge.
It's a massive deal. Like, it's shaking up everything in French politics. And it's not just them, you know? It kind
Mhm.
of shows what's happening globally, too. Democracies are getting, well, more fragile, especially with all the polarization we're seeing.
Right. You've been keeping up with all the news from France, haven't you?
Yeah,
You even sent over a bunch of articles for us to look at.
yeah. There were pieces from, like, Le Monde and The Economist, even a super in-depth one from the Financial Times.
So basically, we're trying to figure out what caused this whole dramatic downfall
Exactly.
and, like, what it means for France going forward, maybe even for the rest of the world.
That's the big question, right? It feels like just yesterday Macron was celebrating his reelection, but his plan to call for snap elections totally backfired.
Yeah.
Big time. Instead of getting a parliament that was united, he ended up with this like chaotic mix of different political groups.
Each one more stubborn than the last.
Totally. Each one just laser focused on pushing their own agenda.
All right, so let's try to unpack this a bit. Macron wins re-election, but his party loses its majority in parliament. That's already a pretty tricky spot to be in.
For sure.
So he goes ahead and appoints Michel Barnier as prime minister. You know, Barnier,
Yeah.
the veteran politician, known for being super calm and a great negotiator.
Yeah.
Seemed like a pretty solid choice at the time.
It did. It did. Everyone saw Barnier as someone reliable, you know, someone who could handle the pressure, bridge the gaps between everyone, and basically steer the country through all the craziness. But, and this is a big but, France was already in a tough spot economically.
Oh, right.
They had this whole mix of problems. Inflation was skyrocketing, growth was flatlining, and their debt was piling up.
Yikes. So basically, Barnier steps right into a political minefield. Not only is the parliament a complete mess, but the economy is on the verge of collapse.
Wow.
What does he do first?
He tries to tackle the economic crisis head on. He comes in with this new budget. It was a mix of spending cuts and tax increases, a pretty classic austerity package, really,
Yeah.
meant to kind of restore some confidence and get the markets to calm down.
Seems reasonable, right? Like, the medicine might taste bad, but it's what you need to get better.
Yeah, exactly.
But this is where things get really interesting, because this budget, instead of uniting the parliament, it becomes the reason Barnier ends up falling from grace.
It's true. The budget set off this firestorm of opposition. You had the far right, led by Marine Le Pen's National Rally, and they saw it as a direct attack on the working class.
Right.
Like a complete betrayal of the very people they claim to be fighting for.
And then, of course, you had the left-wing coalition led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who just slammed it as a heartless surrender to, like, neoliberal austerity.
Yep.
They were saying it would just make the rich richer and the poor poorer.
So basically, the budget debate turned into this proxy war for these much bigger ideological battles.
That's exactly it.
It just exposed all the raw nerves in French society. You know, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, all the anxieties people have about immigration and globalization, and just this simmering resentment towards the political elite.
It brought it all to the surface.
So poor Barnier, he's stuck in the middle of this political tug of war. His attempt to fix the economy backfires, and he ends up alienating both sides. So what happens next?
Well, the opposition sees this as their chance. They sense weakness and they pounce. They table this no-confidence motion, a bold move designed to basically kick the government out and force new elections.
Hold on. So both the far right and the far left, groups that are basically on opposite ends of the spectrum, they team up to take down the government. That's wild.
It is, right.
What does that tell us about French politics right now? It just goes to show how deep the divisions run in France. The political center, you know, the space that Macron represents, it's been completely hollowed out. The extremes are gaining power, driven by anger, frustration, and this deep distrust of the establishment.
Okay, so the stage is set for this dramatic showdown. The no-confidence vote is on the calendar, and the tension in the Palais Bourbon, the seat of the French parliament, must be insane.
Oh, you can bet it was. You have lawmakers from every corner of the political spectrum all gathered in this one place, knowing they're about to make history.
It's like something out of a political thriller movie.
Totally.
The whole fate of the government, the future of France, it's all hanging in the balance.
Yeah.
So paint us a picture. What's the atmosphere like inside the chamber?
Imagine a massive hall, like a grand hall steeped in history, filled with the low hum of conversations, everyone whispering, papers rustling, and this feeling of anticipation of nervous energy as lawmakers are taking their seats.
And then the speaker calls for the vote.
Silence. Everyone goes silent.
It's decision time.
Every single lawmaker, one by one, casts their vote.
A decision with huge consequences.
For sure. Each vote is loaded with political strategy and deep personal beliefs.
And then finally, the moment of truth. The votes are all counted, the results are in.
331 votes in favor of the no confidence motion.
Wow.
A huge win for the opposition, a crushing defeat for Barnier and for Macron.
Barnier, this guy who is known for being a master negotiator, brought down by the very forces he was supposed to be managing. It's insane. A political earthquake that throws France's future into total uncertainty.
The chamber just erupts. Cheers from the opposition, stunned silence from Macron's supporters. The government has fallen.
So now what? What does this even mean?
What happens next?
Do they hold new elections? Or is there another twist coming in this whole political drama?
That, my friend, is the million-euro question. And to answer it, we need to take a closer look at everything that led up to this dramatic climax.
Okay, so we've seen how this political drama unfolded. But the big question still remains. What happens now? This is uncharted territory for France, isn't it?
Absolutely. The last time a French government was taken down by a no-confidence vote, de Gaulle was still in charge. Things are completely different now.
More divided, for sure, and way more unpredictable. So what are some of the things we might see happen next?
Well, the first thing that could happen, and probably the most likely, is that Macron tries to put together a new government.
Like a coalition, right. A team of people who are willing to work together.
Exactly. But finding a prime minister who can keep both the far right and all those different left-wing groups happy, that's going to be tough. Like, really tough.
Yeah, it's like trying to herd cats, right.
More like herding angry, politically charged cats during a thunderstorm.
Okay, so forming a new government is on the table, but it's going to be a balancing act, to say the least. What else could happen?
The other possibility, and this one's a bit more dramatic, is that they hold new elections.
Macron could just dissolve the National Assembly and say, let's vote again.
Exactly. He could hope that the voters give him a parliament that's a bit easier to work with this time.
But didn't he already try that earlier this year with those snap elections?
He did.
And it didn't exactly go as planned.
True, it backfired pretty spectacularly. But he might see it as his only option at this point. You know, a chance to hit the reset button and try to regain some control.
So, new elections are a possibility, but they come with a lot of risk. What's the third scenario?
The third one, and this is the one that worries me the most, is that they just can't break the deadlock.
You mean they just get stuck?
Exactly. What if neither a new government nor new elections can actually fix the problem?
So France is basically stuck in limbo, no clear leadership, the economy keeps getting worse, and all the while the political infighting just keeps going.
That's a very real possibility, and it's a dangerous one. France is a major player on the world stage, a key part of the European Union. If things get really unstable in France, it could have a ripple effect across the entire globe.
This whole thing is like watching a car crash in slow motion. You know it's going to be bad, but you just can't look away. What does this mean for the everyday people in France?
It means uncertainty. It means anxiety. It means this deep sense of unease about the future. They've watched their government collapse. They've seen their leaders fail to find any common ground. It's enough to make anyone lose faith in the system.
It's a tough situation for sure.
Yeah.
So what can we learn from all this drama unfolding in French politics? Is this just a uniquely French problem, or are there bigger lessons here that apply to everyone?
What we're seeing in France is kind of a microcosm of what democracies are facing all over the world. We're seeing this rise of populism, this erosion of trust in the institutions that are supposed to be there for us, and these ideological divides that just keep getting deeper and deeper. And these trends, they're not just happening in France, they're happening in the United States, in Brazil, in the Philippines, all over.
So this no confidence vote, it's not just about a budget or even about French politics. It's like a symptom of something much bigger, a global crisis of democracy.
Exactly. The old ways of doing politics, the idea that people can compromise and work together, it's breaking down. We're moving into uncharted territory, and it's not clear what the future holds.
It's a sobering thought. But before we get too lost in all the existential dread, let's bring it back to France for a minute. You mentioned those global trends. Populism, the erosion of trust, the ideological divides. How are those trends actually playing out in France?
Let's start with populism. Marine Le Pen and her National Rally, they were once considered a fringe group, but now they're a major force in French politics. They've tapped into this vein of anger and resentment, especially among working class voters who feel like they've been left behind by globalization and the changing economy.
So they're playing on people's fears and frustrations.
Absolutely. Their message is often divisive. They scapegoat immigrants and minorities, but it resonates with a certain segment of the population, the people who feel like no one is listening to them.
And what about this erosion of trust in institutions? How is that playing out in France?
The French have always had a bit of a complicated relationship with their government. They're skeptical of authority. There's this underlying feeling that the political elite are out of touch with the average person.
So it's not just about Le Pen and the far right. There's a broader sense of distrust in the whole system.
Exactly. The mainstream parties, both on the left and the right, they've lost credibility. They're seen as corrupt, incompetent, more interested in serving themselves than the people they're supposed to represent.
And how about those ideological divides? Are those getting worse in France?
Definitely. The political landscape is becoming more and more polarized. There's less common ground between the left and the right. Compromise is seen as a weakness, and reaching any kind of consensus is almost impossible.
So it's like a perfect storm. Rising populism, declining trust in the system, and these huge ideological divides. No wonder French politics is so volatile right now.
Exactly. And what's happening in France should be a warning to the rest of the world. We're all dealing with these same challenges, and it's not clear how we're going to overcome them.
Okay, so we've talked about populism, the erosion of trust, and those deepening ideological divides. It really feels like democracy itself is being put to the test here.
Yeah.
But where do we go from here? What happens next in France?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? The future is pretty murky right now, but we can kind of look at the possibilities, based on what we know.
All right, so let's game this out a bit.
Right.
What's the most likely scenario in the short term?
Well, the most likely thing Macron's going to do is try to put together a new government.
Right.
He needs to find a prime minister, someone who can get enough support in parliament to actually pass laws.
But we've already talked about how divided the parliament is. Finding someone who can bridge that gap, it seems almost impossible.
It's definitely not going to be easy. He could try to form a coalition, bring in some of the smaller parties, maybe some of the more centrist groups, or even some of the moderate folks from the left and the right. But, a coalition like that, it's probably going to be pretty fragile, prone to infighting, instability, that kind of thing.
So even if he manages to pull a new government together, it might not last very long. What are his other options?
Well, the other option, and this is a bit of a gamble, is to call for new elections.
So dissolve the National Assembly and hope for a better outcome this time.
Exactly. He could make the argument that the current parliament just isn't working, that they can't address the problems France is facing.
But he already tried that with the snap elections earlier this year, and that didn't really work out, did it?
It didn't. It kind of blew up in his face. But he might feel like it's his only choice at this point.
So it's a risk, but one he might have to take. Are there any other possibilities?
There is a third scenario, and it's the one that keeps me up at night.
Okay.
It's the scenario where they can't break the deadlock no matter what they try.
You mean political paralysis, where France is basically stuck without any clear direction.
Exactly. Imagine a France where the government can't pass any significant laws, the economy keeps getting worse, and social unrest starts to become more and more common.
That's a pretty bleak picture. What would that mean, not just for France, but for the rest of the world?
Well, a week in France would have huge consequences for the European Union. It would embolden those who want to weaken the EU from within, the people who see it as a threat to their own national sovereignty. It could even lead to more countries wanting to leave the bloc.
And what about globally? France is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. They have nuclear weapons. They're a major player in international affairs.
A France that's paralyzed politically would be much less able to, exert its influence on the world stage.
Yeah.
It would create this vacuum that other players, some of them not so friendly, might try to fill.
So taking a step back, what have we learned from this deep dive into French politics?
I think the big takeaway here is that democracy is fragile. It needs constant attention. It needs people who are willing to compromise. And it needs a shared commitment to the greater good. When those things are missing, democracy can crumble.
And looking ahead, is there any reason to be optimistic?
Well, I'm an optimist at heart. I believe that even when things seem really dark, there's always hope. The French people have a long history of overcoming challenges. They've been through revolutions, wars, economic crises. They'll get through this too.
But it's not going to be easy, right?
No, it won't. They'll need to find a way to heal the divisions, to rebuild trust in their institutions, and to kind of rekindle that faith in
It's
democracy.
a tall order, that's for sure.
It is. And it's not just a challenge for France, it's a challenge for all of us. We need to figure out how to make democracy work again, how to make it serve the people, how to make it a force for good in the world.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought. Keep your eye on France. Their story is far from over, and the choices they make in the coming weeks and months will have ripple effects that reach far beyond their borders. It's a reminder that we're all connected, and the future of democracy is in our hands.